Good afternoon and welcome to those joining. We're giving everybody a couple minutes to for all the participants to enter the webinar, and then we'll get started. Looks like we still have probably 30 or 40 more people, maybe more than that, to join. So I'll just wait a couple of more, another minute or so to allow as many participants as possible to get in before we start. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Roach, and I am with Caliber CPA Group, and I want to thank you very much for joining us today and welcome you to our not-for-profit webinar titled Common Mistakes in 1099 Preparation and How to Fix Them.
Hi, my name is Earl McKay.
I'm sorry, Earl.
Sorry.
Earl and I'm a partner in the DC office, and I specialize in accounting, budgeting, and financial reporting, mostly for tax-exempt organizations. And Earl is a manager in the same department with me. Earl provides full cycle accounting for many nonprofit clients. This is our first webinar in a not-for-profit series that we plan to host throughout 2022. So stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. And if you have a topic of interest for your organization, feel free to drop it in the Q&A section during the webinar, and we may cover it in one of our future events. So before jumping into the presentation, let me just take a minute to let you know how the webinar is going to flow today. We will have a Q&A session after the conference. So please type any questions that you might have into the Q&A window, and we will answer as many questions as possible at the end. With a little caveat there that I do want to comment a little bit on the questions that, as you know, many questions with regard to 1099s can get very specific and technical. And so I encourage you to reach out after if you have questions that you don't want to put in the chat in the Q&A, because they're very specific. And as we look at the questions, if our plan is to take all the questions and summarize them and write up answers, responses, and send that out to all the attendees so that you'll have written responses, because many of the questions might take a little bit more time and thought on our part to make sure we give you an accurate response. I don't want to answer off the cuff on something if it gets too specific or technical. If you are interested in obtaining CPE today, continuing professional education, you'll be prompted with some polling questions throughout the webinar, and I will try to stop and make sure we all take a little pause to catch those polling questions. Also, if you're seeking CPE, you'll receive an email with instructions on accessing the program materials and requesting up to 1 hour of CPE. So let's go ahead and begin. So So again, we're talking about common mistakes in preparing 1099s. And so what I want to start off with is just a few kind of real basic tips for 2021. And what's most important is that you have to really watch for any changes and updates, anything new each year. For 2021, the e-file threshold remains the same. You're required to file 250 or more information returns during the year. You're required to e-file if you have 250 or more. And that 250 requirement applies separately to each type of form. One thing I would suggest is if you're e-filing your 1099 NEC because you've gone over 250 and you only have a handful of 1099 miscellaneous, I would recommend just e-filing both. Earl, you probably agree with me on that.
Yes, I do. I definitely do. It's far more straightforward to e-file to 99s altogether. So I would definitely suggest going that route, opposed to the paper version.
The other thing to really pay attention to are the due dates, because there are a few different due dates. The 1099 NEC is due on January 31st of 2022. Paper filed 1099 miscellaneous are due on February 28th, and e-filed 1099 miscellaneous are due on March 31st. So there's a few different deadlines there. And one thing to note too, if you're paper filing and you're assigned to the Austin Submission Center, and as you know, depending on where the payer is located, there are different submission centers where you mail your paper filing forms to. But the Austin one changed address. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes people just have those addresses on file. And it's easy to just look at last year's and do the same thing. And it's kind of another reminder of why each year we want to pay attention to anything that might have changed for the current year. Another little change this year, which does not apply to many people at all. And so I don't want it to confuse anybody, but I did want to just mention it briefly. There's a box that's on actually both the 1099 NEC and the 1099 miscellaneous, and it's a checkbox where you don't actually put an amount in it. But if you happen to be a taxpayer that is selling merchandise for resale, and it's over $5,000, you have to check that box and report it. So again, it's not going to apply to many taxpayers at all, but it's a new box on the form this year. So jumping into the errors, there are basically three kinds of mistakes that you can make on a 1099. You can make a mistake with the payer information, meaning your company information, or your payee information. And if you make a mistake on the payee information, the IRS groups that into two different types of errors, type 1 and type 2. And the types are so that you can understand how to correct them. You can probably guess by looking at this that if you make a mistake in your payer information, it is probably going to impact all of your payee returns. You're gonna probably have the wrong payer information on all of your returns if you're using a system. If you're hand generating them, maybe not, but you will probably have lots to correct if the payer information is incorrect. So if that payer information is incorrect, meaning if you make a mistake on your company or your payer EIN, or the name and address of the payer, you have to write a letter to the IRS. In addition to correcting the payee returns, you have to write a letter to the IRS informing them of the payer error and these various types of information, what type of error it was, what the payer TIN or tax identification number was, Transmitter control number is if you e-filed, and you can get that from your e-file resource, the type of return, 1099, miscellaneous, NEC, et cetera, the number of payees that were involved, and the filing method, that's e-file or paper file, and if any federal tax had been withheld. So payee errors fall into those two boxes, a type 1 error and a type 2 error. Type 1 is the easier error to correct because there's only one form that needs to be corrected. And type 2 is a little more difficult to correct. Type 1 would be an incorrect amount, an error in reporting the amount, an incorrect code or checkbox, an incorrect payee name or address, or if you filed an unnecessary form. And type 2 would be wrong payer information, wrong EIN, wrong recipient information, including a wrong TIN or the wrong form. So to correct these errors, a type 1 error, you just file the new corrected form with the correct amount, the code, the checkbox, and the name and address, and you mark the box that's called corrected. I want to highlight here too, in case there's any confusion, there's a box on the 1099 that says void. Void is different from corrected. These forms at the IRS are machine read. And so, and if you paper file, when you print the forms, there's 2 per page. So if you don't want one of them to be read, you can void a form, but that's very different than correcting. So when you're making a correction, you use the corrected box, not the void box. You send the corrected form to the recipient and you prepare that red copy A to send to the IRS with a form 1096 transmittal form if you're paper filing. If you're e-filing, that correction happened, you use your e-file software to do the correction and you don't need to send 1096. And you don't need to send copies of the original filed forms along with your correction. If you have a type 2 error, you file 2 forms. You file one form that has the same payer and recipient information as the original filed form, but the amounts are changed to zeros and the corrected box is checked. Then you prepare a new 1099 with the correct information. And again, if you're paper filing, you send the red copy to the IRS and you prepare a separate 1096 for each type of 1099 that you're correcting. And again, if you're e-filing, you don't need to file a 1096. And I'm sure you've all now realized in just listening to me that it is way easier to do a correction if you are e-filing these 1099s as opposed to paper filing. And Earl, I know you've done some corrections before. Can you talk a little bit about how much easier it is to e-file the correction?
Yes, it's much easier to e-file the corrections. Largely because when you're doing the paper filing, you have to go back through and track all the changes that you need to make, and as well as reprint everything. But when you e-file, the program should just essentially overwrite and make all the corrections that you need and just overwrite the prior 1096 form. So there's no, you don't have to figure out what box you need to check to mark it as corrected. The program will take care of that all for you, as well as issue the correct copy A's for you on your behalf, as well as a correct 1096 for you.
So we are believers. We started e-filing for our clients, even the ones that are below the 250 threshold, last year was the first year we went to paperless for all of our filings. And we just found it to be so much easier, and definitely reduced the number of errors, and was definitely a time saver for us. And so you're going to hear throughout this presentation that we encourage everyone to e-file the 1099s. So now we're going to jump into some of the most common mistakes that we have found. And we're talking about 10 of the more common mistakes. There's lots more that I'm sure we haven't hit on, but the ones we're going to talk about are not filing a form when one is needed, late filing, using the wrong form, using the wrong box on the right form, no tax ID or an incorrect tax ID, incorrect name and address, incorrect amount, a paper versus e-file error, missing 1096, and then the last thing we're going to talk about are unreadable paper filings and paper filing errors. So the most important thing that I can say to anybody about trying to make sure your 1099s are correct is that you need to educate yourself and your accounts payable team, and anybody who has any who works with vendor payments and or 1099 processing. The best time to learn about 1099s and to learn how to prepare 1099s, even though it's January now and we're talking about preparing last year's 1099s, but really what you should be thinking is, how do I make sure 2022's 1099s are correct? Because if you know what needs to be reported and who needs a 1099, you can make sure that the information going into your payable system and your ledger is correct going in. And then that just makes it so much easier to generate correct 1099s at the end of the year or at the beginning of the next year. So this is a little flow chart for some of the most common reasons we would prepare 1099s. And the three major categories of what payments are included are rents, services, and royalties. And of course, services are the most common payment types that we see issued 1099s issued for. I'll quickly go over the others. Royalties, you need to remember, has a smaller threshold, anything over $10. And rents, rents over $600, similar to services. And rents and services, the next question you ask after you first ask over $600, and remember that threshold are total payments, not a single payment. So if you make, if you have a contractor that does monthly work for you and you pay that contractor, or maybe just a couple $100 a month, it's the total over the course of the year. And another thing I'll mention here is the 1099 year is the calendar year, not your fiscal year. And all of the accounting systems that we work with, from QuickBooks, all the way up to all the web-based services, et cetera, the accounting systems know that. And so when you use the 1099 module within the accounting system, they know that your 1099s are reported on a calendar basis. But if you have an alternate fiscal year and you have any doubts about that, you would want to just test a few of your of major vendors. The next thing I want to highlight here is, if you make the pay, it's how are you issuing payment is a big question. And if you issue payment by PayPal or credit card, you don't need to issue a 1099 because they'll issue the 1099 for you. This is where, again, it's really important today to think about 2022's 1099s. And if you, as you are making payments to vendors, oftentimes in some accounting systems, in particular QuickBooks, people don't always think to check that little box when they're issuing a payment that says, what is this? Is it a check? Is it an ACH? Is it a credit card payment? A lot of people don't use the credit card module to track credit card transactions. And so I would suggest those things to you to prevent 1099 errors. And then again, the system will know which payments to include and which to exclude. If you're anything that's being paid out of your bank account, so checks, ACHs are included. And I want to highlight here too that we use for a lot of our clients, we use bill.com or another accounts payable solution. Those payments are coming out of the checking account as an ACH, or sometimes they're checks that are written that are generated by the accounts payable service, but coming out, they're issued on your company checking account. And so in that case, you include those. The next question is, are you issuing payment to an attorney? If so, you issue a 1099 regardless of whether that attorney happens to be organized as a corporation. For other services, if the amounts are being paid to a corporation, a C or an S corp, you typically do not issue a 1099, but for others, you do issue a 1099. So a lot of information there, but we will get that flow chart out to everybody so that you can use it as a resource if you want, as a handy resource. So the first type of error that we want to talk about are the filing a form when you didn't need to file a form. That's the most common error, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the vendor not being correctly identified in the system, because I think that's the biggest reason. Earl, you've done a lot of 1099s. What would you say is the most common cause of filing a form when one is not needed?
The most common cause is when you set them up inside of the accounting ledger and you don't code the account as a 1099 account, so the vendor is missed.
Or you do check 1099 vendor, even though it's a corporation and they shouldn't have gotten a 1099.
Correct.
And then the system automatically spits it out, which either way is an error. The next biggest reason usually for missing a 1099, overlooking a 1099, is due to unusual payments. Sometimes it's easy to think of standard services that contractors provide to you, especially recurring contractors that have been with you for maybe a number of years. But unusual payments are the ones that can sometimes get missed. And for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's because of the way your system is mapping the accounts. If you use a different general ledger account, what I mean by that is pretty much everybody maps if you have a general ledger account that's called consulting or professional fees, pretty much everybody maps that account to the 1099 report. But sometimes these unusual items like a board of directors fee or stipends, non-employee awards, bonuses, commissions, get coded to a different GL account. And so you miss the 1099 because the account that the payment went to wasn't mapped correctly. Another really unusual item that I'm talking about because unfortunately I saw it with 2 of my clients this year. If an employee, if you have a deceased employee and a payment, whether it's accrued vacation or some type of payment that didn't get dispersed prior to that employee's death, if you make a payment to their estate or after the employee is deceased, rather than reporting it on their as a payroll item and withholding taxes, that payment would go on a 1099. and you're not subject to withholding. And then another, the first polling question came up, so I'll take a couple seconds for people to answer the poll. Another reason that sometimes 1099s get missed is just understanding what your responsibility is when payments are being made on behalf of another. So if you're issuing payment, if you're performing a management or oversight function for another company or individual, and you have an economic interest in the payment as opposed to a mere administrative function, then you would issue the 1099 for that payment. And lastly, non-cash payments. When you issue a non-cash payment, you report the fair market value. And Earl, can you think of examples where you've had non-cash payments that need 1099?
I would say like a gift card, like if you were to give a vendor like $1,000 gift card, that should be included on the 1099. That'd be gift cards or biggest misses that should be included on there.
Great, thanks. That's that, and I've seen that one missed also. So we talked about the biggest reason that 1099s get missed is because when you set the vendor up, you don't set them up correctly in the system. We used a QuickBooks screenshot for this just because it was good size, easy to see on the screen. But I know we work with lots of different general ledger systems, and almost everyone that we work with has some sort of report that you can run to review your vendor status. And it's that little checkbox that we're talking about. So when you set a vendor up, you should always get in the best practices to request a 1099 from all your new vendors. And when you set the new vendor up in the system, using that W-9, using that W-9, if they are subject to a 1099, check that box so that they're noted in the system. And then when payments are made to them, the system will note it to track them as a 1099, potential 1099. You also want to review, and I just want to say, in case anybody's wondering, we're not sharing any real tax IDs. These are all just made up tax IDs. But you want to review your vendor list for missing information, and it's just easier to fix the problem before you get started than after you start running the 1099. So if you see problems with the names or missing tax IDs or missing addresses or addresses that don't look right, that would pop out. And if you are e-filing, you also want to make sure you have the proper email address, an email address in the system if you want to send the recipient copy electronically. And Earl, talk a little bit about how the recipient copies, the tax IDs are masked.
Can you repeat that one more time, Karen?
About how the tax IDs are masked, the Social Securities and TINs.
Yeah, so in typically on the e-file, they're masked with an asterisk, so you only get to see a partial tax ID number when you're e-filing it. There's an option to reveal it, so you can verify the information there, but generally they're masked and hidden. Completing this step, though, it'll helps prevent a lot of those type 1 errors that you come across by making sure this section here is fully populated and corrected. So when you start populating your vendor information, this is very important to prevent a lot of those errors down the road.
The next step in making sure you prevent errors is mapping your accounts correctly. And what we mean by that is, and this, again, this is a screen. We used the QuickBooks for this presentation, as I said, just because it was easy to take these screenshots and they're simple to review, but all the systems have similar type of 1099 modules where you can check, review information. But mapping means you look at all of your general ledger accounts, all of your expense accounts, and you tell the system whether or not you want to be included on the 1099. And so what this means is if you issue a payment to a vendor that had the checkbox as a 1099 vendor, and you code that payment to an account, an expense account that is mapped, for example, to box 1, that information will flow through to your 1099 report for a reportable transaction in box 1. So can't stress enough how important it is to check your mapping every year. Earl, I believe it's adding new accounts. Can you talk about mapping errors?
Yes, some of the most common mapping errors that I've generally come across have to do with either mapping, say you set up a new account on the ledger, and you go through the this is called the 1099 wizard in QuickBooks, but so you go through the 1099 wizard and you fail to map it. When you run your summary report, those transactions won't show up there. Or you may map accounts that don't necessarily need to be issued 1099s. For example, these dues and subscriptions can be omitted. Sometimes people may accidentally map it as non-employee compensation and will overstate what shows up on vendors 1099. Yeah, so you just need to be very diligent about going through this process every year. And even though you map them in the prior year, just relook at them and just make sure nothing's really changed with your chart of accounts set up, or where you're coding your items to make sure that they're being mapped to the proper box, and as well as the proper form in the software.
And one of the typical errors that happens a lot I'm calling it a mapping error, but really it's a coding error. If a 1099 vendor sends you an invoice that has reimbursed expenses in addition to service fees, and you just lump it all into professional fees, that will all go, it'll all feed to the 1099. So if you don't want your reimbursed expenses to map to the 1099, you have to make sure you don't, you break up that transaction when you enter it and you split it into 2 different GL codes. Stipends are an issue, another issue where that cause a lot of mistakes in 1099s. And one of the reasons that stipends cause mistakes is just how different people use the term stipend. And originally stipends meant like a travel stipend, which were advances sometimes, but part of an accountable reimbursed expense plan. And so they weren't included in taxable income because they were reimbursed expenses. But stipends have now taken on a lot of different meanings and may mean something very different to you. And so if anything that you're coding as a stipend is taxable to your employees, you need to include it on a W-2, not on their W-2, not on a 1099. If a non-employee is receiving a stipend, you want to include it on the 1099 NEC. And one of the things that comes to mind there is sometimes nominal payments to student interns. So if they're not doing a full internship and they're just receiving a nominal payment that's more than $600, that would be reported. It's almost like a volunteer, but getting a nominal stipend. If it's over $600, that would be reported on a 1099 NEC. All right, the next type of error we're going to talk about are late filing penalties. We went over the deadlines, and I just wanted to highlight here that late filing can get very, very costly. So it's really important to file by the due date. And we understand, as well as anybody, how busy you get towards the end and when that due date is sneaking up on you. And so the time to start chasing down missing Social Security numbers or tax identification numbers, it's before that due date, because late filing can be very costly. The next type of error is choosing the correct or incorrect form. And we're going to talk mostly here about the difference between the new or relatively new 1099 NEC and the 1099 miscellaneous. And the basic way to think about it is the NEC is used for professional services or service fees, services to accountants, contractors, engineers, consultants, et cetera, directors' fees, service-related prizes and awards, taxable fringe benefits for non-employees. And the 1099 miscellaneous is for rents, prizes and awards that are not service-related, gross proceeds to attorneys, which are not service fees, but like an example is settlements, royalties, and then certain medical and healthcare expenses. Earl, sometimes the choice is whether to issue a W-2 or a 1099. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So as a general rule, employees, active employees, never get both a 1099 and W-2 from the same employer. So like if you pay, it's either going to get a 1099 or you're going to get a W-2. So I keep that in mind whenever you're paying active employees. For foreign recipients who you've done backup withholding for, they would receive 1042 as opposed to a 1099.
And with current employees, if you would never issue a 1099 to an employee who's getting a W-2, you wouldn't issue a 1099 for that same service. There's some rare exceptions there, but the general rule is either if it's an employee, report the payments on a W-2. So how do we prevent wrong form errors? Getting that system set up right in the beginning is the number one way that you will prevent a wrong form error. The accounting systems today are have lots of checks and balances put into them to try to make sure you you file your 1099s correctly. And so if you're using your accounting software, you want to make sure your software is up to date, and you want to look for announcements and releases from the provider. And you want to, if possible, use a 1099 preparation tool that's integrated with your accounting software to help minimize wrong form errors. All right, our next polling question is up. So take a second to answer. Do you, as a general rule, request 1099s from your vendors? Hopefully everybody is saying always. All right, a couple of the most common wrong form errors. Attorney's fees get very confusing because there is a block on the 1099 miscellaneous box 10 that says gross proceeds paid to an attorney. And that box is not for service fees. That box is for example, a settlement that would go to an attorney. Attorney fees for services. So if you use an attorney to provide regular legal services for you in your course of business, those fees would be reported on the 1099 NEC, not the 1099 miscellaneous. And then another very common error is for prizes and awards. So there's prizes and awards are part of the instructions for other income on the 1099 miscellaneous, but that would be something like if you do a 50-50 raffle at an event that you're having, for example, and a non-employee wins a raffle, that those kind of winnings would go on the 1099 miscellaneous. But prizes and awards for service, if you give somebody a bonus for service, a commission, an award for a number of, 5, 10, a milestone service anniversary, et cetera, all of that is included on the 1099 NEC. And I'm talking about non-employee service awards. Employee service awards are on their W-2. These are non-employee. Earl, you want to talk a little bit more about setting up the 1099 module in your accounting software?
Yes. So as you go through that, you want to make sure all your vendors are set up correctly. You want to review all the vendors each year. And for print copies, make sure you order compatible forms. So sometimes Staples or wherever you go, the forms may not necessarily mesh up with your software. So you want to make sure you're getting the correct forms. All the 1099 forms must be printed. You can't write them in. So you want to definitely check on that before you proceed. And then follow any specific software processor guides that you might have for it.
And that's another place where we can jump in and say e-filing makes this easier, because most of the difficulties that I've seen over the years that are the most frustrating is when you get to the point where you're trying to print the paper copies and they don't line up correctly with the boxes, et cetera. And again, most of the software nowadays has addressed that, so it's not as big of an issue, but e-filing eliminates all those concerns.
One thing to jump in on with that, Karen, when it goes back to making sure all your vendors are set up, also make sure that the payer is set up in your module correctly. I've had situations where the payer may have moved offices and they never updated that change of address in their accounting software from year to year. So they're just using year-old information and it prints on the 1099s, and that's incorrect. They move offices the next year. So that's going to be one of those situations where you might have a type 1 error where you need to go back in and just make sure from top to bottom the information is correct. Don't just assume that the prior year's information is the right information just because it worked last year. Always look it over from top to bottom.
And that's a great point, Earl, because if the payer information is wrong, like we said, that means they're all going to have an error on it.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to get into some of the specific box errors. And before we talk about box errors, I wanted to also talk a little bit about some of the box changes on the 1099 miscellaneous in 2021. And some of it's just renumbering of some of the boxes. But this is a good point to make sure if you are paper filing, don't try to use old forms from last year. You have to get the 2021 forms, and the 2021 forms are different than the 2020 forms. So make sure your software is up to date, because if it's not, if it thinks you're using a 2020 form, some of this box information, it's going to get printed in the wrong box because the system might not know the new box numbers. So boxes 13, 14, 10, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, all changed on the 1099 miscellaneous this year. Most of them are for rare items that you're not using. You just want to make sure that your payments don't mistakenly get printed in the wrong box because of a form error or a system error where the boxes aren't correct. So read those boxes when it prints out. And like I said, you can see here, FATCA filing requirement, excess golden parachute, gross proceeds to an attorney, which remember is not your attorney fees, it's those settlement fees. 409A deferrals, this would be using box 12. An example there would be if you allow your maybe board of directors or contractors to participate in a plan, a 409A plan, or box 15 if you have some non-qualified deferred compensation plans that don't meet 409A and you allow contractors or board members to participate. Those would be some examples of what might go on in those boxes. And then 16, 17, 18 report where your state taxes were withheld. So if you're doing backup withholding for any of your 1099 vendors, that's what would be falling into those boxes. Earl, do you want to go over some of the box setup?
Yes. So starting off like with this, the payer information. This is what I was touching on before. This is the 1099 miscellaneous form. For the payer information under the system setup, all the payers information will be inside of these boxes here. Payers TIN, as well as their address and telephone information will be here. So ensure that that's all correct in the system. That'll pull over onto every one of your 1099s. So you want to make sure that's correct. On the miscellaneous form, box 1 is for rents. So the accounts that you have populated inside your accounting system that's mapped to rents shall populate here. Box 2 or any royalties will be populated inside of that box. Box 3 is any other income. And then most commonly is box 10, gross proceeds paid to attorneys. You'll use some of the other boxes, but they're less common. But those are the bigger ones, box 1, 2, 3, and 10.
Yeah, and as we said, if you map the accounts correctly in your system and your software is updated, so you're using the 2021 form, your boxes should populate correctly, but you do want to review just to make sure. The NEC is a lot simpler because there's so many fewer boxes. Again, the payer information, if your information is correct in your system, it should print out correctly on the form. And make sure if you do file backup withholding, you want to really check to make sure that your form 945, where you remitted your backup withholding and reported that, agrees to what you report on the NEC as your taxes, as your withheld taxes. Wrong tax identification number is a big deal. You really, really want to make sure those tax TINs are correct, the employer identification numbers and social security numbers, because if they're not correct, you are going to be subject to a 24% backup withholding. Self-reported errors are corrected as a type 2 correction, but if you don't catch the error and you get an IRS notice of a TIN discrepancy, then you get put into a bracket where you are required to collect backup withholding to immediately get a W-9 and to begin backup withholding and to track whether or not you get a second notice on that same vendor. And if you do get a second notice, you have to continue backup withholding regardless of the W-9 until the IRS gives you permission to stop. So a TIN error is, you really want to avoid the TIN errors. So how do you prevent a TIN error? the best way to prevent the TIN error is to request the W-9 before you issue payments. And a best practice is to request a W-9 from all your vendors. That is the absolute best way to prevent a TIN error. Another thing you can do is use the TIN matching service. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about TIN matching. I'm going to ask Earl to really quickly talk a little bit about TIN matching because I don't want to run out of time. But it is a service. It's a relatively new service that's kind of cool. Earl?
Yeah, so with TIN matching or TIN matching, it's a service that it's provided by a lot of the filing services or tax preparer services, as well as the IRS. So what it is, it's you may have a vendor or a payer, or payee that you don't have their tax identification number, or you're just not confident in the information that you do have. What you can do is you send that over using this TIN matching service, through this TIN matching service, and it will match up with what the IRS has on file for that vendor, and it'll just match it up. So it'll send you back a report confirming that the tax ID number is correct, or even providing you with the correct tax ID number that needs to go on your 1099 form. It can be done as you file the 1099s, or it can be done prior to filing the 1099s. It's a good way of catching all those little errors and ensuring that you don't get a letter from the IRS saying something is wrong.
We can jump forward a little bit. There's when you we're going to send these presentations out, and you'll see some more. The next couple slides just have some illustrations of the TIN matching service, which is, as we said, a really good way to just double check and make sure that you don't have a TIN error. So the next error that we are going to talk about, number 6 on our list, and I know I don't want to run out of time, so we'll try to move through the next few errors a little more quickly, but preventing incorrect information. And we did talk a little bit about this at the beginning. The best way to prevent an information error is to know the limits and know the thresholds, but also to know what payments are excluded. We talked in the beginning, we showed the flow chart, and we talked about what payments to include. Now we want to make sure everybody knows what payments you can exclude from your 1099s. So typically, we said you can exclude payments to C Corp or an S Corp, not legal services, and payments made by credit card, payments made by PayPal. You don't have to report payments for merchandise on your 1099, telegram, telephone, freight, storage, etc. You don't report payments of rent that are paid to real estate agents or property managers. Obviously, you don't include wages paid to employees because those are reported on W-2. Business travel allowances to employees are not put on a 1099. Payments to tax exempt organizations are not included. You can also exclude scholarships and fellowships grants. Those are, if they're paid to a university or an institution, they can be completely excluded. Scholarships and fellowships tend to be, if they're taxable income, they usually should be W-2 income. That's why it's, so we're not trying to imply that all of these or any of these excluded payments are non-taxable, just that they might not belong on the 1099. And then prizes and awards. If you issued a prize or an award in recognition of an accomplishment, a lot of our nonprofits do things like this. If the winners are not expected to perform future services and the payer transfers the prize to the charitable organization, you don't have to report that. Contractors' reimbursed expenses are not included on the 1099, but you really should have an adequate accounting of those expenses, an itemized invoice from the contractor, detailed description of the expenses. And if requested, they should provide invoices, receipts if you've requested them.
Yeah, you'll see a lot of those on like legal bills from lawyers having their transportation or expense costs listed there. So those will be excluded. However, the services will be reportable.
Paper versus e-file error, that threshold can sometimes sneak up on you. If you're anywhere close to it and you like maybe the first round you go through and you're slightly under, but you discover a few more that you need, you could jump over. Again, there are some pending regulations to reduce the number. It hasn't passed yet. We recommend e-filing even if you're under the threshold. Most e-file services will mail out paper copies to the recipients if you request, and that saves you time and it reduces mailing errors. And the e-file service will mask the SSNs for better security for everybody. Sometimes paper filers forget to insert the 1096. And sometimes that happens because when you print right out of your system, the 1096 printing is a different, it's a different print request out of your system. So sometimes people just forget to include it, but it's very important if you're paper filing, you have to also include the 1096. 9 and 10 are the paper filing errors, unreadable paper filing and formatting. Paper filing errors, you're subject to a lot more errors when you paper file than when you e-file. And if you paper file, you should at least make sure that you are generating printed 1099s out of your system. Don't ever handwrite your 1099s. All of these paper copies are machine read, and they're designed to be read in black type. So if you handwrite them and you use like old-fashioned script or bad printing, the machine's not going to be able to read it. Even if you're using, if you use a typewriter or you're printing them out of your accounting system, you got to make sure you don't choose an italic or a spaced font, or don't choose a different color. Don't use a $ or special characters, but do use a decimal point. So don't round the numbers. Don't enter 0 or the word none in a money box unless you're making a correction. Don't ever cut the forms. The printing will put 2 1099 on the red copies that go to the IRS. They'll put 2 per sheet. Don't cut that sheet in half to cut one out. Even if one is blank or if one is void, just leave the whole sheet there. Don't ever cut them or separate them. And also don't staple them or tape them or try to hook them together that way. Submit the entire page, even if some forms are blank, and don't fold them up and try to squish them into a little envelope. Put the IRS copies in a flat mailer. And a really big one, don't ever try to change the title of a box. And believe it or not, I have seen this years ago. And a typical place where it was seen was where people didn't understand that proceeds to an attorney, and I'd seen people like scratch that out and say fees. But don't ever change the title of the box, because the IRS is machine reading all of these boxes, and so you're not going to get it. Our last polling question came up, and then some final tips. That QuickBooks wizard in the system is not a real wizard. You have to put the right information in the system in order to get the right information out. Always save a PDF copy. If you're paper filing, send those IRS copies via certified mail so you have a record of it. Be sure to select your payment method when you're processing payables. Do a review of your key expense areas, your professional fees, to try to help flag errors. Again, consider e-filing, even if you have fewer than 250, and run a report that shows both your mapped payments and your unmapped payments to see if it makes sense. This is just a little screen that would kind of show you the unmapped payments, and you can see where we typed in $2,000 in the attorney box. You see something like that and you say to yourself, why do I have $2,000 of unmapped payments there? You want to drill into that and just make sure it makes sense, make sure it's right. All right, and that concludes our presentation. I think we probably have time for a couple of questions. So one of the questions we got was, how do we report fellowships? Fellowships, if you are paying a fellow to do work for your organization, you should consider having that fellow. It kind of gets into that question of a W-2 employee or a 1099. Either way, that is probably, if it's over $600, it's going to be taxable income. If you are paying your fellow a salary, you probably should have them as an employee. And if they're, if not, definitely a 1099 NEC. Are there any situations where an employee might receive a W-2 and a 1099 from their employer? There are some situations where they might. One kind of simple one for everybody to understand is if you're using a contractor in the beginning of the year and then you convert them to an employer, that would be a situation where you would give them a 1099 for that time period where they were a contractor, and then a W-2 where they converted to an employer. Another situation, much less common, if you know, let's say one of your employees, you have an employee who is who has a side business doing maybe doing interior decorating or interior design, and with a business partner, and so you move to a new office and you hire this person in a totally different capacity to do some decorating services for you through their other interest in their other company. That could be another reason. Do Canadian vendors get a 1099? No, they do not. They get, Earl, you can talk about the form that goes to the Canadian vendors.
Yeah, so generally foreigners would not receive a 1099. If you do backup withholding for them, they would receive like a 1042. But we can send you some information on that if you need.
Someone asked the question, is there an e-file software that we recommend? Earl, you've got a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, so the one we've gone to and we use regularly, it's called tax1099.com. And it's pretty straightforward to use. You can import your data from multiple different accounting softwares, as well as Excel. If you have information in Excel, import it into the program, and it rolls over the information from year to year. So far, I haven't really had much issues with it, so that's one good one. There are a couple others, but I would have to gather those names and share those with you guys.
Someone asked, is it 600 or over 600? It is 600 or over, and on that flow chart, it was supposed to have the little greater than or equal sign underneath it, but 600 or over. Somebody also asked, does it matter if I send my lawyer a 1099 NEC or a 1099 miscellaneous? For legal services, you really should use the 1099 NEC. The miscellaneous, as we said, is for proceeds like from a settlement, not for regular fees. Lots of people have asked if we will get copies of the slides, and yes, we will send copies of the slides. What is it? Somebody asked, what is a taxable fringe benefit for a non-employee? An example, please. For example, if you allowed a non-employee to be a part of a non-qualified benefit plan, if you provided transportation costs for a non-employee, transportation like parking and transportation allowance for a non-employee above the IRS thresholds. If you think about the various benefits that you offer, if you offer any of those to a non-employee, you have to think about whether or not it should be reported on the 1099.
Just follow up. One person's asking the name for the service. It's tax1099.com is the service we used.
And we will look at all of these questions. As I said in the beginning, we will provide detailed questions and responses, written responses, so that you guys can have a record of the questions and the answers. And some of them are a little bit more complicated, so we'll make sure if we need to do a little bit of research, we will make sure we research those questions for you. Somebody asked if the IRS is cracking down on employer tax ID numbers that don't exactly match the corporate name or name of business. I have not seen notices where there was like a simple error, like maybe you didn't include the, comma, Inc. or maybe an abbreviation or something. I've been told that the IRS, now that they're doing a lot more electronic matching, is cracking down. I haven't actually seen them crack down on that, but I have been told that they are starting to. So it's a good idea to make sure. It's always a good idea before you start your 1099s to try to make sure that you're using the correct legal name, not a DBA. And again, that's one of those things that if you do have an error, it would be an error across all of your forms. So it's really good to check that. Somebody asked about contractor expenses where the contractor doesn't provide backup. Your contractor should at least provide you with an itemized invoice. They don't necessarily have to give you all of their receipts if you don't request the receipts, but if they itemize their invoice so that you can clearly see what those items are and you can apply a reasonableness test to it, you should be able to at least see that. If they just give you just a flat fee amount, and obviously you can't split it, then you would report it all. And when in doubt, if you report the full amount, then it's up to them on their end, on their tax return to report the deductions. Also, if you have contractors where you have questions, that's again, if we should try to really train our accounts payable folks and discuss those things as those invoices come in and are paid, so that you code them and split the invoice and code those expenses, reimbursed expenses, to a non-1099 mapping account if you don't want to map them in. think we have just about hit our time limit, but we will go back through all of the questions, and if we missed any questions, I know we missed some questions, so we will make sure we cover the questions that we missed in our written responses. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you very much for attending. Please reach out to us if you have any additional follow-up questions or anything at all that we can help you with. And good luck to everyone as you prepare your 1099s this year.
Thank you.